Yes.
Yeah, hello, I'm Dr. Mikey Georgeson from the University of East London, and this concerns the Dewey Decimal Dowsing project. The presentation, like the project itself, concerns a temporary shift from the communication model to that of expressivity. And most of the images that you see are student research, and they're intended to entangle with my ideas rather than illustrate them. So, after being encouraged by my colleagues to present something on the Dewey Decimal Dowsing project, the idea of the question came to mind: why did you start the Dewey Decimal project? In its first year, it felt like a promising endeavor when a student rang her mother as soon as she had started her research. Such was the strength of her connection to the material dowsed for. This was before my doctoral research had led me to affect theory and a passion for performative intra-relational modes of understanding. But I think in retrospect, I was still trying to share a passion for learning as an embodied and contingent process. I'm pleasantly surprised that the intuitive use of numerology and dowsing in the library still chimes with my present sense of meaning making as something extra embodied and relational. The use of ritual process in numerology and the apparatus of the dowser creates an opening to the temporary experiment in entanglement, or what Alfred North Whitehead describes as the percipient perceiving the region with themselves as part of it. That's one of my favorite quotes that explains what I'm trying to do through my collaborative research. My point being that somewhere in this digression is that decisions in research and learning are extra embodied and relational in their dynamic, being led chiefly by feelings for the felt intensities of intuition. This project doesn't reject finer modes of understanding, but repositions them in a tapestry of transformative emerging encounter. My own art practice is shaped by a desire to encounter felt understanding through a processual methodology. Keynote speeches delivered as a made up professor or confessor, Kimi Pekpo, are an experiment in transmitting affect within a temporary region of ritual as an intra-relational part of the world. Research with vibrant matter via Jane Bennett, agential realism, Karen Barrett, have contextualized an intuitive idea to help students expand personal agency via the intra-relational encounter with apparatus, in this case, books, dowsers, and most recently, photographic enlargers, and a specific region, the library, studio, and darkroom. The Dewey Decimal Project asked participants to transform their name into a numerological number. Upon locating this number's shelf in the library, dowsers select 3 books. Artifacts are materialized, shared, and verified, and a report presented. This whimsical method of interacting in the library has implications to show how attunement to non-linguistic frequencies in vibrant matter is fundamental to intuitive agency. The ritual becomes a performative entanglement, helping to make materially vital research as a form of what Karen Barrett calls an onto-epistemology. Dowsing and divination are a means of augmenting intuition as an extra embodied way of making meaning inside the event. And this is a quote from Carl Jung. So I think it reflects the idea of a data identity to the embodied identity. And there's a little video here with no sound, so I'll read the transcript. It's a fundamental skill we all have that's just not used much these days. But you can train yourself to use your intuitive powers. It's just that we're very focused on water and we're very good at finding water. So, um, oh, sorry about that. Yeah, before Dowsing, the process is foregrounded with this video of Guy Hudson, who has an academic background in physics and engineering, talking about his work as a professional water dowser. Hudson encourages dowsers to feel the atmosphere of the area being investigated. The Dewey Decimal Project has perhaps been about making this atmospheric experience of the library available. Was it also, I wonder, a ritual means of materializing intuitive pleasure in what Gilles Deleuze refers to as taking everything and making it matter for expression? Part of this matter for expression, safe to say, is my feeling that libraries contain a sense of subversion, asking that we forget a procedure of knowing what it is we are looking for and venture into what McLuhan calls the forest of symbols, unearthing intensities of felt understanding. In the digital age, this process of numerological library dowsing can seem anachronistic, but opens into something I once called backwards causality, because it felt like the creation of a temporal substance through embodied experience rather than a linear causality of intention. The time-obsessed artist John Latham famously sent students of St. Martin's to the library to chew pages of Greenberg's revered book, Art and Culture, and place the soggy vestiges in glass vials. I sent mine to douse for numerological encounters with felt understanding. This act holds a random, absurd humor when seen from the realm of classical epistemology, but in what affect theorist Grieg Sigworth referred to as my derangements, there is a desire to facilitate a feeling of being part of research as an emerging intra-relational meaning. As Claire Colebrook suggests in Deleuze and Irony, humor is not the reversal of cause and effect, but an abandonment of before and after relations, the very line of time that allows us to think in terms of causes and intentions of grounds and consequence. Since the inception of the project, I've become aware of how the process appears to open onto something ordinarily in excess of research in a secular institution, allowing students perhaps to express something they feel is being left out. Last year, in a break from lockdown, my extended family gathered in a hospital to guide my father in his passing after a short and tragic battle with interstitial lung disease. The same week, during the Dewey Decimal Dowsing Project, a student I had hitherto considered so shy they could barely express an idea, spoke confidently to the group about a book called The Puritan Way of Death by David Stannard. I took profound comfort not only from his growth in confidence through an emancipated learning, but also the relevance of his research to my personal life, as he himself explained. The dying institution changed drastically, where the processes leave the feelings of loneliness, irrelevance, and absence of awareness. The dying process is more non-social, often avoided by family and friends. Commonly, hospital staff avoid telling relatives of the patient's seriousness of illness for fear they will desert the patient. The patient is faced with a world of doctors and nurses. The student has not become a philosopher, but continues to use ambitious 3D making in their illustration practice. I am skeptical about the relationship between the moving synchronicities, and what could be considered my cognitive bias, discounting numerous examples where students have remained in a representational mode. The sheer volume of student research is currently beyond my powers of systematic analysis, and so I will continue with a story. In the conclusion to There Is No Natural Religion, Blake concludes, if it were not for the poetic or prophetic character, the philosophic and experimental world would be at the ratio of all things and stand still, unable to do anything other than repeat the same dull round over and over again. Why did he begin the Dewey Decimal Project? Was there a conceptual desire to bring the prophetic or lyrical voice into research? Driving to college in an aqua blue Skoda Fabia to begin the process, he senses a need for the security of academic frameworks based on pre-given goals, imparting concepts. This year, there will be no need for the intense synchronicities, only a practical exercise in intuitive research and a passing acquaintance with the idea of experience as meaning inside the event. Driving past the undulating hills on the A13 of the country's largest landfill, folding the eye into a sense of bucolic serenity, he hopes primarily that he is not late. Arriving on time, he will later leap in surprise, as there on the screen is the book Process and Reality and the Face of Alfred North Whitehead. This is a book he loves and has helped him to maintain what he sometimes fears is a fanaticism for an aesthetic ontology or a cosmos with feeling as its most fundamental characteristic. He would never have brought this book into the Foundation studio because it is baffling even to doctoral students, despite it trying to outline a simple thing: felt understanding of the percipient perceiving the region with themselves as part of it. After acknowledging he did realize that he had leapt out of his skin, he sees the opportunity to explain how Whitehead wrote the book in an attempt to create a model of the cosmos based on feeling, after realizing that his previous book with Bertrand Russell, Principia Mathematica, had tried to build a model based on logic, which left feeling and experience out of the equation. Next to Whitehead is a book on cyberfeminism, and he floats Masumi's idea of the virtual as a realm of excess beyond the text-based control systems of analogous thinking, something Masumi calls the empire of like. The projectacy, as we shall now call it, has always sought to bring the familiarity of structural documentation to the free-form nomadic encounters suggested by its methodology. One year, quite early on, a very self-motivated student, turned the project into an aphoristic distillation of 3 words. In his desire to give the next year's students a strong example of how to approach the project, or in other words, demonstrate that it had validity with previous iterations, he shared the students' presentation called the Brazilian Lemonade Script. When the projectacy is adhered to with a systematic neutrality, the potential for new insights presents itself, and he, just as he hopes the students will, must have the patience to value these resonances as they vibrate through the temporal substance of a continuum of learning to learn. Looking back at the Brazilian Lemonade Script research document, he finds that the 3 books discovered through the numerological dowsing related to Latin American literature, and he is struck by a concern with bringing the lyrical voice into research, or what Whitehead calls the really real of the processual drops of experience. Indeed, he thinks it was Whitehead who pithily remarked, "Seek simplicity, but do not trust it." Had he then, in his desire to create a target learning process, simply trusted simplicity too much? The aesthetic lure of the title Brazilian Lemonade Script alone convinced him that this simple synthesis of 3 words would help other students to assess the felt intensities of an intuitive, extra-embodied and performative passage through the library. Thanks to the archival structures of digital academia, he is able to return to the document, and there he finds the word lemonade, so redolent of innocence and direct pleasure, is taken from a book about Hélène Zixius and makes specific reference to her écriture féminine. There is a pleasurable irony too that script derives from heretical empiricism by Pier Paolo Pasolini. Zixius's concerns chime with those of William Blake, who was also deeply concerned with liberating the feminine aspect, and he took it upon himself to create a region of understanding based on a radically extrasensory aesthetic encounter. This requires that we acknowledge the relational feeling of experience as part of meaning, rather than insisting that knowledge can be conveniently extracted and distributed out of context. Zixius's écriture féminine speaks of all his hopes for the trance ritual encounter of the projectacy. As Susan Sellers says, it is believed to originate from the mother in the stage of the mother-child relation before the child acquires the male-centered verbal language. This pre-linguistic unconscious potentiality manifests itself in those literary texts abolishing all repressions, undermine and subvert all significations, the logic and closure of the phallocentric language, and opens into a joyous free play of meaning. He now thinks how demand to grade and quantify within a gridded interface may have acted as an enteric coating, preventing the knowledge from dissolving in his gut. So he feels its extra embodied effect now, over 6 years later. He considers how the slow movement of learning through a personal and experiential coming to understand is something that he, as an academic, can at times feel as a kind of longing or even madness in the case of Pirsig's Fridas. The students delivering their new findings often somehow feel newly wise to him, and the enriched feedback loop of learning is akin to the ideas proposed by Rancière, whereby the learner is emancipated from the enforced stultification of the explicator who, having thrown a veil of ignorance over everything that is to be learned, appoints himself the task of lifting it, only by concealing knowledge from the student is the explicator able to teach it. Considering his intuitive direction of delivering the paper in a fictional voice, he considers too how Rancière himself wrote The Ignorant Schoolmaster as a story. Kristen Ross explains the very act of storytelling, an act that presumes its intercalator and that and equality of intelligence rather than inequality of knowledge posits equality, just as an act of explication posits inequality. Pondering now how the need to share linguistically in virtual teaching led to this new awareness, he wonders whether object-based outcomes had somehow endangered the felt understanding, because students heading straight from school were inclined to focus on creating a cohesive outcome. His intention had been to elicit something from the clay that they themselves needed to encounter with other learners in order to experience a collective sense of understanding. The use of processual making was also inspired by David Gauntlet's Making is Connecting. Rancière claims that the point is not to contrast reality with its images or appearances, but to create new works of fiction, different realities, different forms of common sense, different spatial temporal relation systems, different communities of words and things, forms and meanings. The challenge is then to somehow deliver the projectacy and allow it to flex and adapt to specific events in the regions that the students find themselves in and retain the sense of emergence that drove its inception. This was chiefly a desire to create a framework, or more accurately, a ritual that opened the library into a space for an intuitive, extra-embodied encounter. As adult researchers, we perhaps embody the pleasure of expressing in order to create a machine for collective understanding by rediscovering a toolkit we had left behind in childhood. This reminds him of Adorno's idea that we might remember our indigenousness to nature. Does it matter that so many of the resonant discoveries seem to interweave with the aims of the projectacy? He had always been keen to make feeling a fundamental characteristic of the experiment and resist a convenient shorthand of synchronicity and coincidence, because this maintains the idea that the radical experience of extra-textual is supernatural and not, as Aldous Huxley explains, entirely natural. Perhaps the senior lecturer would have left his position of seeking a performative mode of understanding were it not for his encounter with Karen Barrett through one of his doctoral students. Barrett is keen to develop this ethico-onto-epistemology, and this is how he had once found congruence in the process of facilitating a specific personal encounter inside the event of research. After all, this is exactly what John Dewey, who is coincidentally the foremost champion of the radical experience, sought to bring to our collective learning experience. Even his framing of this methodology as something temporary chimes with the experimental and contingent nature of the project's aims to unfold digressionary nature of ordinary life into research. It's worth quoting this in full, he thinks, because he found himself reminding students of the speculative nature of their endeavors in order to facilitate a kind of nomadic freedom. So Dewey says, if one is willing to grant this position, even if it is only for a temporary experiment, he will see that there follows a conclusion at first sight surprising. In order to understand the meaning of artistic products, we have to forget them for a time, to turn them aside and have recourse to the ordinary forces and conditions of experience that we do not usually regard as aesthetic. We must arrive at the theory of art by means of a detour.
We need to wrap this, Michael.
There we are.